We're here to announce first-degree charges against the violent offender who fatally stabbed an 11-year-old boy and critically injured the boy's 33-year-old mother. Let me start by saying this is something that should have never happened. This offender, who I will not dignify by naming, was just paroled from prison the day before he brutally attacked this family. A felon with multiple felonies in his background. He was out on parole while still serving a 16-year sentence for home invasion where he caused injury. This was the second time being released on parole. When he was first released on parole, he violated the order of protection against him and was taken back into custody by the Department of Corrections.
Yes, a man is paroled. He shouldn't have been paroled. He has a history of violent crimes. He has a history of harming women. We're going to go through those details in this unpacking step by step. For those of you who aren't familiar with this channel, we cover parole hearings. So this specifically sticks out to me when we see that a parole board completely fails. And we're going to go through the repercussions of that and the following steps and how I feel about it. But with that, let's jump in.
New details now in the murder of an 11-year-old boy stabbed to death defending his mother. Tonight, we've learned the accused killer got out of jail just one day before the attack. CBS 2's Tara Molina reports the man has a long history of violence.
A history dating back more than 15 years, and we're learning more. Police say she had a temporary order of protection against him, and he had a history of domestic violence in his record, just released from prison the day before all of this happened.
What happens when parole board members let out an inmate, and how does that happen? Do they lose their job? For those of you who aren't familiar, it's the governor that handpicks parole board members. It's not a position that is voted in by the constituency. It's actually a handpicked position. So how would the governor react? Would he fire the board? Is it their responsibility? Let's find out.
After the CBS 2 investigators pressed the state for days, they finally admit mistakes involving the release of an inmate from Stateville Prison. Hours later, that inmate is accused of going on a deadly attack. Meanwhile, two key state employees responsible for his release resigned today. Our Megan Hickey picks up the story from there.
Jaden Perkins's loved ones gathered for a celebration of life Monday, less than 2 weeks after the 11-year-old's friends and loved ones gathered near the Edgewater home, where he was stabbed to death on March 13th. Police say Crissetti Brand had the knife.
The offender was released from prison yesterday.
That's right, he was paroled and released from the Illinois Department of Corrections custody the day before the murder. And that release happened despite Jaden's pregnant mother, Lataria Smith, who was also brutally stabbed, pleading in court last month to try to get a protective order against Brand. A Cook County judge said a March 13th follow-up hearing about the order of protection that both parties were supposed to attend and directed Brand be notified in prison. IDOC and the Prisoner Review Board that gave the green light on Brand's release both told us they didn't know about this protection order hearing. But emails and other records obtained by the CBS 2 investigators since this attack appear to contradict that. A February 22nd email states an employee with the Office of the Clerk of the Circuit Court of Cook County emailed the notice to an IDOC employee who she also spoke with on the phone. Today, a spokesperson for the clerk's office confirmed to us their office provided notification. Attempts to reach that specific Stateville Correctional Center employee were unsuccessful. Shortly after we submitted this new evidence to IDOC and the Prisoner Review Board for comment, Governor J.B. Pritzker announced the resignation of Prisoner Review Board member Leanne Miller, who wrote the report recommending Brand's release from prison. It is clear the evidence in this case was not given the careful consideration that victims of domestic violence deserve, Pritzker's announcement said in part. Also announced the resignation of Prisoner Review Chair Donald Shelton.
So there you have it. He has a board member resign. Now, they have many board members. So really, this only makes me ask many more questions, which is, why is it that there's one board member resigns and then there's a senior review person, Donald, that also is meant to resign? But when they have, look at how many members they have on their board. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. None of these are the names of the recently resigned. So do they only have one board member make a decision for each parolee? Is that how it works in Illinois? You know, what we're used to in Connecticut and Louisiana is that you have a minimum of 3. And if it's not just one, then how come only her head is meant to roll? I mean, she seems to be quite a veteran. The prisoner review board must be able to operate independently as review enormously difficult cases. But I believe Leanne Miller made the correct decision in stepping down from her role, said the governor. It is clear the evidence in this case was not given the careful consideration that the victim of domestic violence deserved. And I am committed to ensuring additional safeguards and training are in place to prevent tragedies like this happening again. Of course, Governor. My thoughts are with Latira Smith as she recovers with her entire family. Now, to give the governor credit, he did fire people. If that means to give credit, I guess he could have, we've seen everything. He could have just said, no, everything's great. But I think it's a little bit of a cop-out. By the way, on this note, I do want to say thank you to Griggs for pointing out this case. Jen did as well a little after Greg sent it over, and Richard for even while he's recovering after having his kidney removed to still put together all this research. It's quite incredible. But Governor Pritzker has asked PRB to engage experts, advocates, design, implement, expanding training for PRB members related to handling DV cases. The governor has also directed PRB and Illinois Department of Corrections to review the current rules and procedures for receiving information related to cases. And let's go on. As administration continues to review the facts in this case, it may pursue broader statutory policy changes to strengthen PRB view similar cases moving forward. The PRB is an independent bipartisan compromise. Well, I would say good. Why don't you make this information public? Why don't you have parole hearings that are streamed to the public? Because that's what parole hearings are meant to be. They are meant to be public hearings. They are not confidential. Did you know that Louisiana the parole board actually, and this is interesting, I just found this, finally, it says here what the board does, right? The board makes confidential recommendations to the governor relevant to clemency petitions. Do people realize that? Why would the board have a right to make a confidential recommendation to the governor? Maybe we just take it for granted. You see, if you're not familiar with this channel, we cover parole hearings out of Louisiana and Connecticut. And they're not confidential. They are public hearings. So we see when the parole board members make a recommendation to the governor, and we have seen hundreds of cases because it's public. We may fault Connecticut and Louisiana for all their flaws, but at least they are keeping the information public. At least we see all the mistakes that they make, and we can hold them accountable. But in this case, this seems to be all behind the doors, private. Even the idea that it might just be one parole board member, I don't know. It's actually not clear to me. But anyways, I think it's a cop-out that the governor just had fired 1 or 2 people. And that was, just, but what can he do? Maybe I'm just venting or digressing. Now, for this case, like I said, we're going to go over some details that we have, and thank you, Rich, for finding it from his previous case, from one of his initial charges. And this is the court transcript that he filed an appeal. And if you look at the date, the appeal was confirmed March 13, 2020. Pretty crazy that someone can get, I think, a 15-year sentence, have the appeal denied, and 4 years later, he's out on parole. And mind you, remember, He was let out on parole and he violated it. His parole was revoked and then he was still released back into the public. And we should do a FOIA request on what this parole hearing did or did not look like. Every state kind of has a different process. And I think it's Georgia where the parolee doesn't even get to show up at their parole hearing. It's all done without the parolee even there, if you can imagine that. So this is what he did to his first victim. At trial, the victim testified that the defendant was her ex-boyfriend and that they had dated about 2 years. Now remember, she is not related to this specific crime. She was the original victim as to why he's in prison. Okay, so she's not involved in this instance. But on October 30th, 2015, until she ended the relationship on October 30th, 2015. On November 3rd, 2015, 4 days after she ended their relationship, the defendant showed up at her place of employment to speak to her. She don't want to speak to him. So later that evening, 7:15 p.m., Ms. Shannon was in her apartment preparing dinner for her 4 children when the defendant knocked on the door. She opened the door about 6 inches, so you crack it open, and told the defendant that she no longer wanted to be with him. The defendant told her that she needed to come with a better answer than that. So Ms. Shannon closed the door. Now the defendant knocked on the door again. Ms. Shannon reopened the door just enough to peek out and told the defendant that if he did not leave her alone, she would call the police on him. The defendant then pushed the door open, barged in, locked the door behind him, and put a gun to her chin. The defendant grabbed Ms. Shannon by the shirt collar, pushed her up against the wall next to the bathroom door, and began choking her. Ms. Shannon's 15-year-old son, so here it is again, a son coming in to protect their mother, stepped forward and asked the defendant what he was doing. The defendant told Maurice to get back and pointed the gun at him because, he's a brave man. The defendant eventually dragged Ms. Shannon into Maurice's room and banged her head against the dresser and threw her to the ground. Then the defendant ran into Ms. Shannon's bedroom from where she heard the sound of keys jiggling. The defendant exited the bedroom and fled the apartment. Ms. Shannon got up and locked the door behind them. She looked out the window and saw the car and was gone, and she called 911. And it goes on. And he ends up getting the sentence of 15 years. And of course, he gets paroled early. He gets revoked, as we heard, for violating his parole conditions, but then gets out again. And, they're talking about having restraining orders and having this. And, that's also a cop out and a joke because a restraining order would have done nothing to stop this man. What would a piece of paper do? The only thing that could have been done to stop him was to have kept him in prison. And it's hard to comment on who was at fault because we don't have the full picture. I'm not going to jump in and blame this parole board member that had over 10 years experience and say the governor's doing a great job. We need to know the process. We need to know, did the inmate come down and sit down? Did the parole board members ask him what he did? Did they hear how his mind worked? Or did they just look at a piece of paper and say, well, he took this program, he took that program, he has this amount of days of good time, he only has 2 write-ups or no write-ups. Okay, parole. Understanding that would get to the root cause of the potential problem here. But until then, it's really just a lot of noise. The governor making right moves to make himself look good. You know, the news agency saying, wow, our investigative reporter found out that an email was sent and they did a great job. And everyone's going to pat themselves on the back and say, carry on. But it's all going to be for naught because we fix nothing. I would like to stay on top of this and track it through and see what changes they ultimately make. But I don't believe they're going to make any real changes because we have short-term memories. We forget. And I think this is just one more explanation point as to how important and why it's so important that these hearings are made available to the public so that we can hold those responsible for keeping our community safe, from the district attorneys to the judges to the parole board members, all the way up to the governor who handpicks them, so we can hold them accountable. And with that, I'll let you